Ready to have some fun? Let's do it. I think probably nothing will teach you more than just experimenting. Do as many different things as you have the nerve to do. Shoo, just go for it.
The authors of this book, Happy Clouds, Happy Trees, the Bob Ross phenomenon, they chose an interesting word to end the final chapter of their book, radical. And it's especially interesting when we take into account who it is that word is describing. In fact, throughout the entire book, they suggest that the way Bob chose to present himself was actually way more calculated than he lets on. Maybe even manipulative. You
just sort of make up ideas and drop them in. Whatever feels good, do it. Shoot.
It's worth mentioning that, such a radical claim might be easily dismissed if we didn't take it into account that the main author here, Kristen G. Congdon, two of the three authors are professors, and the main author, Congdon, is a philosophy professor at a major university, University of Central Florida. And, they're academics, and with that implies a generally more rigorous approach to anything that you're going to choose to write a book about. So it's not scientific exactly, of course, but it's also not easily dismissible. So it really made me think. I'd seen dozens of episodes of The Joy of Painting, but I'd never actually sat there and given any more thought than we all probably do. It's just a painting show. It's easy to watch, simple. He seems like a pretty relatable guy. A guy who just really likes to paint. But by around page 40 in the book here, all that goes out the window. When they start discussing his charisma, for instance, they make comparisons to gurus and how he was even known to have a cult-like status in some circles. They start making a connection between his famous style and the legions of students he was able to attract, ultimately. Saying that, for instance, on page 156, he masterfully and consistently crafted contexts that would enhance his viewers' understanding of his work and strengthen their connection with his persona. And some of the phrases they use, page 158, they say he manipulated the media. They say he, quote, found a way to navigate the dehumanizing tensions of that same technology, TV, during his time, by creating an image of his personality that reflected his personal values. And then on page 40, where it really kicks in, honestly, is they say he deliberately chose specific anecdotes and even employed, quote, ritualistic phrases. And these helped create a mythical persona that's, quote, hypnotic and magical, leaving its viewers in a TV trance. They compared his performance to a kind of social sculpture and even, quote, teetered towards the erotic.
Actually feel it. It's one of the things I like so much about oils. Gosh, they must be a quarter of an inch thick in places. I love that. Absolutely love it. Areas that are very thick, areas that are thin. So I say, I still get excited about this. There you go.
One that, quote, can't be experienced except through complete immersion. To Congdon, the Bob's legacy was one that was, quote, both sublime and seductive. She rounds out this portrayal by insisting that his TV show, page 161 here, was orchestrated as a timeless, darkened, void-like studio which reinforced intimacy with his body and suggested both spiritual.
We spend so much of our life walking around looking with never seeing.
And sexual.
I get excited when I see these. They turn me on.
Possibilities. It's clear to her and the authors, the other co-authors, that Bob, what he was doing was consciously shaping the viewer experience, all while hiding behind a facade of this ordinary, everyday guy. The authors even display an almost reverence towards him, that at what Bob was able to accomplish with this image, saying things like, again on one page 161, Bob's aesthetic choices are sophisticated and effective. 164, we believe, quote, he felt compelled to engage the real world with incredible intelligence. You know, he really was employing actual hypnosis techniques. He spoke softly.
Least little touch and just let this sort of play. Mean there. A little bit right in there.
He related repeated specific words and phrases that became like ritualistic mantras of his.
We have some happy accidents sometime, but we don't make any mistakes.
And let's not forget the, almost subliminal metronome when he's sitting there tapping that he created. I guess I'd have to take this out. As he's blotting the brushes or, making his forests, his trees.
We're having such a lot of fun doing these trees. We might as well just keep going with them.
Keeping up a soft conversation with us and just ritualistically, methodically creating a whole landscape in front of us. But it serves the double purpose of an immersive experience, a sound, stimulus that's just steadily going on, boop, in the background. I'd suggest it dissolves people into a state of suggestibility. And when you really combine that with the fact that he's over there launching a steady barrage of soft slogans all the while.
Maybe we'll have a little pink in the sky. I sort of like that. And in our world, we can do anything that we want to do here. Any old thing.
It starts making you wonder what it was that Bob was actually up to.
Now I got to get rid of that. See, but if you do one of those, you do a cloudectomy, and you're in business again.
But he was luring us in, wasn't he? I mean, first he had his appearance. He caught our attention with it. It was an almost oxymoronic fashion sense. He had the white afro, the 60s, 70s counterculture, but it was just interestingly juxtaposed with his fairly subdued, collared button-down shirt, pretty timeless. No frills. I mean, it was the 70s, early 80s when having bigger the better in some fashion circles kept a little sensual, keeping the first few buttons opened up. But he had his collared shirt tucked into his pretty timeless blue jeans. Those, other than having a few more rips nowadays, haven't really gone out of style, have they? He lured us in, I would say, even further with his warm, inviting personality. He kind of got us to stay and let our guard down, Instantly, I would say it disarmed most people to hear someone with such a relaxed cadence of speech, just carrying on a natural, charming conversation. And he was tranquilizing his audience from the get-go with this routine, plain speech, the repetitive introductions that really didn't deviate a whole lot.
Hello, I'm Bob Ross. Hello, I'm Bob Ross. Hello, I'm Bob Ross. Certainly glad you could join me today. It's a fantastic day here, and I hope it is wherever you're at. Are you ready to do a fantastic little painting? I'm glad you could join me today. Today I thought we'd do a nice, beautiful little winter scene. Hi, welcome back. I'm certainly glad you could join me today. You ready to do a fantastic little painting with me? Super. Hi, I'm glad you could join me today. Today we're going to do a wonderful little painting. Hi, welcome back. Certainly glad you could join us today. I thought today I'd show you a little painting that is so simple. Hi, welcome back. Certainly glad you could join us today. I thought today we'd do a painting. It's very simple. I think you'll enjoy it. Hi, glad to see you again today.
They make a fascinating narrative out of Bob, but it's fundamentally one of endearment. The thesis at the bottom of this book, The Bob Ross Phenomenon, is that through an almost saintly earnestness, possibly even has a few shamanic characteristics, therapeutic ones, Bob Ross was seducing his viewer, but he was seducing them, even challenging them to experience joy. The carefully chosen descriptor in the title of his painting show. You know, words are often thrown around, especially in the marketing sector, to just, again, get your attention. Bob actually meant joy, true joy, experiencing not his joy, but our joy. And the authors spend an entire book making the case that that's what Bob's covert mission really was. A real, authentic joy of our own. And we could find this in picking up a 2-inch paintbrush.
It makes painting accessible to everyone. People who take classes with our instructors, they find on the very first day, they go home with a completed painting. Even people who have never painted. Isn't that fantastic?
As Congdon and the boys say about Bob in his seemingly pedestrian paintings, they talk about that too. Quote, Bob's paintings aren't paintings. Bob's paintings are an excuse to practice joy. And that's where future generations are going to detect the art in Bob's life. He created a meaningful, complicated art practice that supported a simple yet accessible vision of happiness. It's an Emersonian, back to nature almost, rigorous notion of simplicity and goodness. And we'll elaborate on that and much more in the coming rest of the video. So, I can understand it almost sounds like a portrayal of Tony Robbins, some self-help guru, or someone even cheaper than him that's just out to sell books, you know. But Bob and Annette were selling books, but they were only paint instruction books, how-to books, at least back then. And we'll be getting into that as well later, but that's not the focus of this video. The books he was making, they were bare bones, just had a little, introduction and biography on Bob, but actually tracked down a couple of them. They were, first and foremost, paint instruction books. Oh, I see a little portrait of Steve there. There we go. Steve makes an appearance too. Steve's appearance on Bob's program have become a very popular addition to the joy of painting. Not only does he display an extraordinary ability to paint, having trained at the knee of the master, but his good looks, charm, and wit have made him a fan favorite among students across the country. Having mastered this technique of painting at a very early age, it's no wonder that Steve has become one of the most popular Bob Ross certified instructors. Kind of interesting that either Annette or her daughter Joan probably wrote that little blurb on Steve. But other than that, oh, that's a beautiful one. I like that. A little intro by Annette, a little about the artist section, probably also by Annette. These books weren't self-help books, they weren't psychology books. They weren't advice, other than in the actual embodiment of creating art. Throughout Bob's life, he'd found a deep source of a meaning in painting. And when we break down what he was actually doing with his life and see why spreading joy, we're gonna see why. When spreading joy sincerely, as Congdon and the company say at the last page, to put it into its proper context now. When sincere, joy is always radical. He didn't want to teach an art class. He wanted to lure people into art class so that could radically transform their perceptions of themselves. This wasn't a cavalier attitude towards art and teaching. Bob knew that most people actually believed they were useless, that they weren't creative at all when it came to art, at least. Some people took it further. And that you had to be born with talent to become an artist. That's not true at all. And Bob thoroughly believed that, and he often expressed it, saying that talent is a pursued interest. And I think that's beautiful. And this book elaborates on so much more than that. Gives evidence, puts Bob in the context of the greater art world, compares him to some other artists. On one side, Andy Warhol for the more fine art crowd. And on the other side, Thomas Kinkade for the much more, I guess, much less niche audience of the Christian consumer. And they find that Bob has a place in a lane all of his own. And they interestingly wrote this book in 2011, well before, over a decade ago, recording this in May of 2022 to date it. Way before social media and even YouTube, although they make remarks about YouTube, became what they are today. They were much less, today they are much more platforms of personalities. I mean, it's really what I'm doing here. Finding out about things I'm interested in and just trying to relay the joy and the genuine interest, the excitement that I have for, even though it might not sound like excitement, certain topics that I find personally meaningful to know more about in the world. Bob knew that most people were quick to beat themselves up, but he thought this was all baloney.
I can't draw a straight line. I don't have the talent, Bob, to do what you're doing. That's baloney. Talent is a pursued interest. In other words, anything that you're willing to practice, you can do.
Congdon shows throughout the book that Bob really believed that people, everybody, had something genuine, a unique perspective, something uniquely and deeply creative to offer the world. All they had to do was let their guard down long enough to swallow the self-actualization Bob was steadily and subtly pushing. He did it through a constant stream of encouragement peppered throughout his instructions.
And since this is your world, you can do anything in your world that your heart desires. Just let your imagination take you to places that you never dreamed you could go.
He stressed the vital importance of creating something for ourselves and not just passively watching others create. Although he understood, quote, passively watching him was exactly what a lot of people, most, 96% apparently, as we'll get into later, were tuning in for. But that was fine too.
We get letters from people say they just sleep better when the show's on. That's all right. So I thought today we'd do a happy little painting, one that'll really make you feel good in here.
Because 4% of hundreds of thousands of people is still thousands of people that Bob was helping do more than just relax. He was helping them create a deep sense of identity, something they could really anchor their self-belief, self-worth into. He wanted others to see that the moment they decided to join in on the painting, they'd see something beautiful happening. They'd see that they're making something beautiful. And he knew from experience how powerful that feeling was. Just like his mentor, Bill Alexander, relayed on his show that Bob was so influenced by.
Tell yourself you are wonderful. Then you get in that almighty swing that has to... There is so much power in a human being if you just ask for that.
We'll be talking about Bill, too. Page 130, or page 37. Says that Bob, quote, makes the viewers believe that, like him, they too can be great painters. They can take control of their lives. It doesn't need to be complicated, but it does take practice. And on 143, the goal for Bob was problem solving. It was a process that was clearly one of his missions. When you make decisions about what goes on your canvas, you gain control of your life. You recognize that you're powerful. And this newly gained power can manifest itself in other parts of your life. And I think Bug's having some fun out there with Mama. If you're wondering what that little toddler sound is out there, that's my baby girl. Just living her best life. I think this is the whole, really this, the point of this book is realizing that Bob had been through a lot in his life. He had a lot of trauma, a lot of tragedy in his life, and another thing, we'll be going over his as much as I could find about his life with a pretty fine-tooth comb. So there's so much that was interesting to round out his and flesh out his character, who he was, make more clear his motivation for doing what he did with this. It was a lifelong passion of his. He didn't always make money with it, and that might be the point of this whole book, is what Bob was able to accomplish both materially and spiritually. he recognized, and he even passed it on to his son, how important and meaningful getting even that 4% of his audience to recognize how powerful of a feeling, and how it can embolden you when you create art, genuine art from your heart, from inside, from a place that you may have never tapped into ever prior to that, you know. So when he could see the smile and the genuine warmth and satisfaction and pride people got in creating that art, most of the time something they never even knew was inside of them, that made Bob's life, that made his life meaningful. And he often said that too.
But always believe in yourself, and believe in your ability and what you can do.
One of the sentiments Bob often used from his mentor, Bill Alexander. In painting, there's a lot of technical concepts that I don't actually know. But light is a huge one. You want to have contrasting light and dark so that they accentuate the other. And Bob and Bill, but Bob really took it to heart. They related that the metaphor of light and dark applies pretty aptly to life in general. Bob would explain how, the importance of dark colors in making the light ones really shine through. It gives depth and richness to a painting, and it's clear that he passed on this metaphor as it relates to life to his son, Steve. That even during the darkest of times, the act of creating can help us discover something profound about ourselves.
You can't have light in a painting unless you have dark. As I've mentioned before, it's just like in life. You really can't know happiness. I don't believe unless you've known a little sorrow in your life. Otherwise you wouldn't know when the happy times come.
Bob was doing something both simple and complex at the same time. At its core, his actual surface level instruction was just providing a general direction, a general design outline of what to paint, how to paint it. And, on top of that, he was also offering an affordable set of tools. You didn't need to buy 1,000 paints and tools. You just needed a few basic supplies to get you up and running. And that was all he wanted to do. He just wanted to get our foot in the door. But the more nuanced interpretation of what he was doing was that he was making something intimidating look easy. He was transparently and patiently walking us through even the smallest steps for us to be able to succeed, most importantly. He was lowering the barrier. This is a huge concept to entry, the barrier to entry into the art world for millions of outsiders. He was making it look fun. He was always encouraging us to bring a sense of play to it. That's really important, really important. We're going to elaborate on that in an entire section of the video later, about how life without a sense of play lacks a lot of depth. Bob lowering the barrier, Bob making it look fun and easy, was crucial in simply just bringing to being the possibility in people's minds that they could do it. There's an article in Far Out magazine talking about one of Bob's classic lines, "Let's get crazy."
Let's take some Van Dyke brown, dark sand. I'm just mixing them on the brush. Here we go. Yep. There's one big monster. Let's give him a friend. You know me. I think everybody needs a friend. Even a tree. Even an old tree.
It's enough to make even the stuffiest watcher loosen up and let the warmth of Ross's Florida tones wash over them. And then, once we recognize that nuanced aspect, we can take it even deeper, the layers of what Bob was doing with his show, The Joy of Painting. Once we recognize that Bob was roping us in, effectively, by making something fairly complicated look easy and change the perspective that most people have of what it means to be an artist, we can see that there's deeper psychological levels that open up, like as we're painting. If we paid close enough attention to what appeared on the canvas, Bob believed that we'd really discover something we could call our own, something we could anchor our sense of self into, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah, in the magazine here, there's a section on one of the current Ross instructors. He had some turmoil in his life of his own, and he recognized that some of the things that he noticed in his paint instructions was giving students a renewed sense of agency. And that was important. That was really important, to have a sense of effectiveness, of having a possibility to do something and make an impact, and even to stick your neck out there and try something new. And seeing where we unconsciously went when we were painting, with our own personal visions of these pristine mountainous landscapes, Bob gave us a general direction towards. We'd learn something about ourselves. We'd learn what we literally find ideal by how we crafted our own version of that variation of that landscape. We learn also, though, that the horizon of possibilities with what we could do with our own lives just blew wide open. And I think more than creating artists, Bob wanted to create he wanted to create individuals, to use a psychological term. Once people realized they could paint, what else? Where would it stop? What else could they do with their lives? And if that horizon of possibility really blew wide open, maybe even enough to an almost frightening degree for some, you might realize, it might make sense that it's just safer to pretend you don't have talent. Let's let someone else take that risk, not me. And that's dangerous outlook to have. Congdon's final book, point in the book, is that if we're lucky enough to have such a life-changing, altering experience as that, we could honestly say then that Bob showed us the joy of painting. In the documentary, Steve has a revelation, and then they paint it, of course, artistically, dramatically. It's a documentary, and just like writing or film, they have to have a accentuated drama to it. But it was artfully done, skillfully crafted, and by all accounts, it seemed to be a truthful revelation Steve actually had when he was dealing with the loss of his dad for 20 years. He had a renewed sense of agency, sparked by encouragement from those around him, primarily Dana Jester, his Bob's painting friend, and Steve's as well. And he said it's important. He realized what painting, picking up a brush again, did for him and his psyche and his general sense of well-being, I guess. It's important to express yourself through that kind of symbolism, to get out those emotions. And we may not realize it, but that's exactly what it is. When human beings create something from nothing, often, maybe if not always, there's a layer of symbolism to it that we might not even be consciously bringing to it. It might be under wraps, unconscious, but it's there, and it's revealing something about ourselves that maybe we didn't realize.
Bob would just make him so happy, it's unreal.
There's a lot going on besides painting, and I think people are aware of that and they enjoy that.
The authors ended the book beautifully by commenting on this general experience and its relation to Bob's legacy. They say Bob could have been a despot, exploiting those who bought in, those many people who bought into his comforting vision. But from all we've learned, he used that power to heal and inspire, rather than repress and deny. Bob leaves behind hundreds of artists who will now navigate their own worlds, crafted by their own sensibilities and their own desires. And whether they treat self-expression as ironic or incomplete or invaluable, Bob taught them that painting is an occasion for joy. He always said that. Bring happiness to it. Clear your mind. Lead with your heart. Bring a sense of optimism, buoyancy. And the last paragraph, to put it in proper context now, is that is Bob's legacy. It's joy. It's sublime, seductive, but it's inspiring. It can't be owned, it can't be ironic, because it's immersive. It's something you can't keep at a distance. Something you have to either experience or tune out completely, or you just don't understand it. It's healing, it's connecting, it's beautiful, and most of all, when it's sincere. Joy is radical. And it really is. It's an experience that you don't walk away from feeling like you've, it's easily written off as a trivial experience. It can change you and change your perspective of both the world and yourself, and what the possibilities of both really are. And I thought that was beautiful, and that really launched me into the rest of this video, wanting to know more about Bob, primarily from the documentary on Netflix, but also there was an article written by I always get his name wrong. What is it? Ramsey. Alston. Okay. I guess I had it right. Alston Ramsey. Sex, Deceit, and Scandal: The Ugly War Over Bob Ross's Ghost by Alston Ramsey. Written for thedailybeast.com. It was a really extensive. He interviewed dozens of people. Steve and Dana Jester, the Kowalskis. And it actually came out before the documentary on Netflix came out. I use those two, along with this, as my main sources for this video. But I wanted to, like I said, I'm going to get into some of the more sensational details, but that's not the purpose, because ultimately, although it's kind of interesting and it's sad, and I do, with many people, one of which knew Steve personally, I was able to contact Alexander Cruz. He was a really nice guy, and we'll be talking about his testimony and his own perception of what happened with Bob Ross Incorporated. Definitely not the same as Bob Ross. Later, I was able to find just a sense of respect for Bob that I didn't want to make the dramatic sensationalism of the documentary the main focal point of what I did, because I probably couldn't do it nearly as good as both of these sources did anyway. And I'm personally, obviously, with what I'm doing here, I'm very influenced by what Bob did and his legacy, and this book pointed me in the right direction. I'm going to be heavily relying on it when we start talking more in depth about Bob's legacy and his relation to the wider culture in general. Bob Ross's warm voice first hummed out of flickering bulbous glass TV screens in 1982. Just another low-budget TV painter. An obvious successor to Bill Alexander. And his first attempt definitely was low budget. But as the 80s carried on, more Americans and eventually the world began to pause when they stumbled across that trademark afro. His charming Florida drawl invited the men to join him as he moseyed happily along through a deceptively efficient painting demonstration. And by the early 90s, as his health declined, his popularity soared. 80 million regular viewers would ultimately welcome him into their homes, glad to have his companionship in the anonymity of the sprawling suburbs of late 20th century America. 14 years after his debut on TV, he died tragically at only 52. He was receiving hundreds of letters a day by then. And 4 decades on, this rural Floridian painting Alaskan landscapes is still reaching millions, though. And now he's been uploaded to the internet. He's still teaching, still entertaining, still soothing. His voice, artistry, and his humble philosophy, importantly, is endearing him to an entirely new generation, born since he even passed. And through that gradual, mysterious cultural process of appraisal, denial, acceptance, Bob Ross is becoming the stuff of legend. His life proves that he had always pursued his passion, and pursued a means of capitalizing off it and the skills he cultivated while doing so, but it didn't mean he was necessarily destined for TV. Actually, had it not been for the pioneering techniques of earlier and a little bit different TV artists, most importantly his mentor, his direct teacher, Bill Alexander, his almighty teacher, Bob might have remained in obscurity. Actually, he could have been fated, and this is my little fictional fate of Bob Ross if he hadn't appeared on TV to make an honest but modest artist's living with a home base in rural Fairbanks, Alaska. He might have been just another guy selling novelty paintings to Alaskan tourists, to augment his military pension. His life legacy might have only amounted to the memories of a few thousand students, if he did start teaching, and the sales of some competent landscape paintings that quietly hung in the living rooms of a few hundred people until, with time, and of course the arbitrary tastes of new generations of those original patrons of his, they'd inevitably be lost to history. And just like that, none of us would have ever had the opportunity to experience what Bob, this amazing person, was trying to communicate. The joy of painting. But we all know his trajectory was to become much, much, much more than that, and to reach a far greater number of people. He was to become the Bob Ross, the artist, entrepreneur, celebrity, teacher, and even as Congdon, Blandy, and Kuhlman argue in their insightful book we just talked about, a therapist and a healer. It could be argued, and it will be. I think convincingly so, actually. Like all legends, Bob has an interesting backstory. And to understand old Bob, it's important to follow his journey from his humble beginnings through to his tragic end, with lots of highlights and bursts of color and success in between them. He had luck and opportunity, and surely at least some artistic, innate, genetic instinct and talent, but he wouldn't have achieved the status he did without any serious dedication that he had, and he put into his passion more than anything else, I'd say. And we'll be tracing all these variables with the focus on Bob the man, that summed up to see the individual we see in his shows now. But the tipping point definitely came with his introduction to Bill and his following mentorship. We'll see he left Florida, moved to Alaska and a few other places, working in the Air Force. In a fateful series of events and a determined sense of individuality that characterized Bob led him to have these doors opened. And it's those same doors that he wanted to open for other people with his Joy of Painting series. If you listen to Bob throughout the first 6 seasons, you'll interestingly note him promoting and using magic white. That was crucial, integral to make the wet on wet technique work, to make these beautiful paintings in just 26, 27 short minutes. And by about series 6 or 7, a couple years later, and he did about 3 to 4 a year, you'll notice him switch to liquid white. Technique that Bill had been demonstrating on his show for years was really the key that opened the doors for Bob. And this is an important point, and that's what Bob's success pivoted on, and it's beautiful because of that to see him pay homage to Bill in the first episode of season 2. And Bob, following in Bill's footsteps, as we'll see later, also relied on Bill and Bob working under him as his actual employee for a couple years on their in-person classes across the country to earn a living. And his wet-on-wet technique was crucial for teaching well before TV, so in-person classes so quickly, which allowed them to finish sooner, sell more, and that's always good for business. Now, every article about Bill and Bob makes sure to remind us the general concept of alla prima, meaning, I guess, Latin or Italian for first attempt, meaning you could do it all at once in your first attempt rather than make layers of oil, the background, let it dry, revisit it a few days later, taking weeks and months to finish in the more standard traditional style of painting. We're always told that was around 500 years old, invented in Italy and Europe during the Renaissance, because Bill somewhat legitimately later claimed to have invented the alla prima, the wet-on-wet, as he called it descriptively. But from what I was able to learn, Bill was in fact owed that recognition, and that's why I'm making a point to recognize him the way I am as a key player in Bob Ross and who he became in his successful TV show and business model. Because Bill actually was able to streamline and popularize the technique, and we'll be getting into a whole little section on Bill in his own interesting life. Very determined, marked by exceptional determinism and determinism, possibly a little bit of that too, but just hard work and effort for Bill towards creating this technique. Bill stripped it down, usually apparently involved hundreds of supplies, and Bill was able to radically reduce the number of materials needed for it. And so I'm not sure, it's not entirely clear that Bob actually would have been able to come up with this or stumble upon it if Bill hadn't paved the way, been a traveling art instructor, developed his own magic white that Bob in the Kowalskis would later almost rip off. But you can't quite say rip off, that's a little manipulative. Bill wasn't the only one doing it, and it wasn't as magic as Bob or Bill would have liked people to have believed. But nonetheless, I think, from what I understand, there is a possibility that without Bill there would be no Bob, and I want to give him his due. This, I feel like it highlights Bill's precedence that on PBS in the early 70s, that without which is another factor in Bob's popularity, in the standard by which Bob had to go off of. Without both Bill and later even the Kowalskis' savvy schemes I'll be getting into to give them, the devil is due, to give them their due diligence, their fair perspective, Bob wasn't a solo act. He had events around which his life pivoted and relied upon to make the joy of painting as successful in the legacy it has and continues to have. So we can safely say that that chapter of his life definitely opened the doors to his success. Exiting the military, going into a risky, changing lanes, becoming a paint instructor, reaching out to Bill, finding him, being determined to find and become a student of Bill after seeing him on TV. We'll be getting into all of this in the detail later, but that's certainly a significant chapter in Bob's life. Meeting the Kowalskis, Annette teaching her in a class in Florida, and her having a background of going into risky business ventures with her husband, ex-CIA agent, who clearly knows a thing or two about negotiation, and having a supportive wife, a charismatic son who was played an important part in Bob's image on TV that he cultivated. All of these factors went in to make Bob's complicated legacy, his nearly 15-year run on TV, as great as it was, and allowed him to reach as many people as he did. We'll be arguing that he is, in fact, a cultural phenomenon. I'll be elaborating on it pretty extensively. And hopefully you guys will walk away with or wake up maybe, with a sense of understanding Bob at a much deeper level, having more respect for the guy, having an impression of Bob that you didn't quite get with the documentary or even reading the article. If I did my job, I'll be able to have Bob make sense as a human being, and a great one at that, and impress upon you the importance and the beauty of what Bob actually did and was able to accomplish with his 52 short years. The magic of oil painting was Bill's show. Bill pioneered the outward premise of Bob's show, the joy of painting. Drop the magic, drop the oil, place the magic with joy. This was the art of producing a beautiful oil painting in just 30 minutes instead of the more usual 30 days, like I said, that most traditional oil painting techniques took. I'll be telling Bill's own story, but, it's Bob's magic that accelerated beyond, added to and accelerated beyond, I'd say, to what Bill was ultimately able to accomplish on his own. Bob's TV presence went beyond interesting painting techniques. It went beyond even a reverence for nature and that glimmer in his eye that even Bill was known to have. Bob's magic, I'll argue, was an additional layer of depth that Bill never quite was able to tap into. And maybe it was a language barrier, but I think it's more a personality trait. It swelled up in Bob's quiet charisma, his reserved optimism. It was in the understated, endearingly old-school American charm with which he taught Bill's technique. Bill was great, but Bob was a clear improvement on Bill.
You better become round. See, they're all the happy little tricks I show you.
Just have a good feeling and be happy and in love with life and your world and sit down and begin playing.
The title, The Joy of Painting, I think it says something in and of itself. On his painting show, Bob didn't speak to the camera lens. He spoke to the individual. He spoke to us, the one person sitting in the room right next to him, being taught by him. He deliberately held a personal conversation. He explicitly stated that he curated the experience to be a close, private lesson in a comfortable space with someone who he personally cares about. And that was new, that was novel for TV in the early 80s. Later we learned even that he modeled this on how he might talk to a woman in bed, one-to-one. Interesting and perceptive, given that his student base was largely women. Later, he spoke calmly, softly, vulnerably. Most importantly, I'd argue sincerely, though. And being so vulnerable was exactly what allowed us, the viewer, to drop our guard when we watched him and follow along with his premise, just wandering through his happy little world as he created it and encouraged us and compelled us to believe that we, if we just picked up our happy little brush, could create our own too. I'd say it was a masterful display of skill to be crafting both a painting and an experience the way Bob did, throughout a whirlwind display of painting in and of itself. It was a masterful, very professional, expert demonstration. He was able to maintain a wit, a natural conversation, an effortless and positive exchange with us. He was constantly affirming our fellow painters, our the students of his, painting along in our living rooms, our creative choices, affirming them, not negating them. He was constantly coaxing us away from our self-demeaning preconceptions. He was always demonstrating to us how to keep an open mind. Bill could whip up some masterful landscapes, and many think he was even the better painter of the two, but it's clear that Bob's magic, I think, was his empathy. His deeply genuine, caring personality. You need to listen to an episode to just hear it in his voice. He felt love for everything in his world. Each little bush, each little happy little tree had a story of their own. They needed friends. They were homes to little forest critters, especially like his little squirrel Peapod Jr., and then Bobette. Everything in his world, importantly and uniquely and sincerely, authentically, deserved consideration. And that's what made him endearing, and to have a lasting legacy the way he did. He really believed it. He told it to us, And maybe the most cherished bit of Bob's philosophy that we, the viewer, and hopefully fellow creator, artist, student, person he could, the person touched by his attempt to inspire the general audience. We deserved consideration too, and I think that's the therapist part about him. He wasn't from a privileged background. He was a working class guy. He understood the slog of daily life, the monotonous 9 to 5. He knew that most weren't tuning in to actively follow the detailed painting instructions. He knew that most people were just watching him like we all watch TV and now YouTube and whatnot, to take a break, to check out, you know. He knew most were there for an escape, to relax, and he was okay with that. Over the years as an instructor, he taught thousands of students. He was on the road. He'd really put in the work for years, teaching at hundreds of venues all across America, thousands of students. Sometimes only one showed up. Sometimes the classes were packed, and his show was a huge conduit for getting that message out. But that had an important effect in shaping his understanding of who he was actually talking to on the show. He actually had an example, a demonstration, an instance. He understood who his viewer was, his average person. He knew their struggles. He knew the obstacles getting in the way of picking up the paintbrush, and even the ones after they did pick it up. He was making that sincere connection with his students that made him who he was, really. Alexander Cruz, I mentioned before. I reached out to plenty of people, as many as I could, including his son and Dana Jester. Didn't get any responses. I did get one back from a former student of Bob's. So Alexander was kind enough to respond to me, and he only reinforced my positive image of Bob. Actually, he added depth to it, which is exactly what I was hoping for. It was really cool, and really, I'm really grateful that Alexander allowed me to not only hear another story, but also tell you guys a story about him and Bob in the 90s, watching a space launch. Aptly enough, I guess, for my channel being mostly astronomy based. So this just made me like him more, but also gave me a lot more respect for just being an example of Bob's vision and his forward thinking, his progressive, his imagination, his just the way he lived life, and what positivity, and clearly how he was able to impress the people he interacted with. Cruz says that he was only 17 years old when Bob took him under his wing and taught him the real joy of painting. He was his mentor, and he said he was like a father to him. He would take any chance, any opportunity to teach him life lessons as well. So he was a student, and he lived, Bob taught in Daytona Beach, Florida, around there. The shop is in New Smyrna, which is not far away from there, and that's fairly close, within, say, about an hour, 45 minutes from Kennedy Space Center, where a lot of rocket launches in Florida, Cape Canaveral is. And so you could see rocket launches all the time, and they were at a hotel convention, the first CRI, Certified Ross Instructor reunion at a hotel on the beach. And Alexander says how Bob was always putting big dreams into his head. Anytime he could. So he said, we were at the convention, we had a blast there the whole week. It was scheduled, there was a rocket launch scheduled during the same week, and so they all, of course, went out to the beach, out to their hotel balconies to watch it. And he was saying, he was 17, he was there with his mom in the room, and he looked down and saw Bob motion him from his balcony to come join him. So he turned around, asked his mom, and said, hey, I'm going down with Bob. And he said he went and sat down, and Bob started talking about the current events and things. And when we saw the rocket, he told me, quote, how wonderful it is that men can achieve something like this. Just imagine you, Alexander, could be the first artist to paint the Earth from the moon. How beautiful is that? How impactful must that have been to hear your mentor tell you you could do something so astounding, so unimaginably futuristic, How far into the vision, how expansive does that make your sense of possibility with your life? I thought that was so beautiful. And he said, remember that this is the guy who I admired, and he's telling me to dream big. That conversation, says Alexander, that stood with me in my mind and in my heart very palpably since then. He said, like I said, he always had advice for me, tips for life. That's one of the things I loved about him. And he says he's got many more stories like that. And there's one more in particular I'm going to share with you guys later on. That was also a great example of another aspect of Bob's mentorship and who he was as a person. Spoke a lot in volumes about his character. And I think I chose to put that there, talking about Bob's empathy and personality beyond, in addition to. It wasn't a substitute for his lack of mastery and skill and discipline and competence as both instructor and painter and TV show host, which is probably not easy to do. You could see in the first couple seasons he's a little shaky, it's kind of like me now, he's a little unseasoned in his ability to be at ease with the screen. It's cool watching over, 11 seasons, something like that, him get more and more comfortable and at home, talking to us at home. By the time Bob had started his show in 82, even though there was a learning curve for him to develop his TV persona, he'd already honed his teaching style. He had already been on the road. His wife faithfully, he and his wife faithfully partnering with the Kowalskis we'll be talking about soon. They took a huge financial risk at the start of their venture. This wasn't any guaranteed success by any means. But Bob had recognized, along with the people around him to support him, what he had, and he'd climbed out on a limb in search of the fruit that he always proverbially encouraged us to do as well. So now in 2022, of course, we have the advantage of hindsight. His YouTube channel has over 500 million views, probably a lot more if, by the time you're watching this. We see that the tacit experience, the unspoken experience going on there between Bob and who his audience was went far deeper than the the liquid white. Liquid white his landscapes rested upon. In fact, it could be argued, as Congdon does in her book, Blandy and Kuhn were co-authors too, by the way. I kept writing Congdon because she was the main author. That painting, what he painted, landscapes specifically, was not just a thoughtless mechanism, a medium for him to transmit his message. It was actually possibly the most apt medium and subject matter Bob could have chosen for it. So, as he walked us through his own imagination, he used the developing scene as it appeared on canvas with all its understood intricacy and ecology to help us appreciate our own creativity and to have gratitude for even the smallest bushes, all the most crooked trees, and to have a gratitude for all the analogous moments in our own lives. Yeah, it's not to say, though, he couldn't have expressed it through, different mediums. I just think it made and makes sense the more we'll be stringing that argument together later. There's plenty of other examples: music, cooking, dancing, maybe even, I thought, a carpenter. I've been renovating, we've been remodeling our house recently, and I've been watching a lot of YouTube artists and DIYers and people teaching how to, general advice, work on your car, construction, a lot of tradespeople, and I was thinking I could definitely imagine a carpenter, a soft-spoken woman, or an old, grizzled old man, doing it, teaching us in a Bob Ross style, softly measuring, scribing, and cutting the wood, piece by piece, guiding us through the process of, putting together an end table, something. Just a few ingredients, sprinkling throughout of their personal musings about beauty and life, anecdotes from their own lives. I definitely tune into that, So it's not necessary that painting is the medium, but I'll argue, and Congdon makes a great point, that it helps, and it helps get the message across, and it's perfectly just harmonious with what Bob's own philosophy was. It's within this frame of helpful instruction and his apt choice of grand natural landscapes that Bob's legacy fully forms. I think it's most apparent in the companionship he offered the viewer. His earnest message of hope, that might have had the most lasting effect, especially on those who need it, because he understood that. His overtly cheerful attitude that so many found endearing, it wasn't an artifice, and that's the beautiful part about Bob. From what I've learned about him so far, over dozens of as much as I could read and find about him, it actually came from a place of serious concern and understanding for those in pain. Old Bob really believed the folk wisdom he often shared with us. It wasn't just a cheap gimmick. It was his gimmick, but it was sincere and true to him and his character. He apparently lived, laughed, and loved with the best of Karens. But during that living, he'd also been touched by tragedy. As the Joy of Painting series progressed from 82 to 95, especially in the early 90s, you can see it. Like when he puts the dead tree in episode 5 of season 28. I think it was about 92.
Boy, that's a pitiful looking old tree. He had a rough life. He's like me. There we are.
And by 92, he had definitely been there. Often during filming, he actually was there. In his 52 years, he'd experienced divorce, rifts, serious chronic health issues. We'll be addressing that later, too. Multiple losses close to him. And most of this, it was all. Some was before, but a lot of it was during his run at the Joy of Painting, and somehow he fused it. He didn't let it define the show, but he definitely artfully incorporated it into his message and his persona. So I think from this, his personal aim was more nuanced than just a money-making machine of an army of painters and students. You know, he was interested in that too. He was trying to support his family, but he traveled all across America, like I said, because he'd put in the work. Because he'd put in the work, I think he really had his ear to the ground, because he was an outsider himself, and he knew how to sit back and perceive what worked, what didn't, what people really were like, what spoke to them, and he was able to. To me, from everything I read, everything I saw about him, all the stories, the anecdotes, he was just a salt-of-the-earth guy. He was down to earth, and he had a sense of how liberating learning to paint for the average person really could be.
That paint on that canvas, you are doing something that up until that moment was in a couple of tubes and a blank canvas, and you're taking those same exact things, and with just a little bit of energy, you've taken this and made it into a creative and wonderful thing.
His mission was about demystifying this whole thing. It seemed so formidable to many, intimidating. Like I said earlier, it's not something people lightly think, oh yeah, I could do that. I could paint. Let's go sign up for a class, and I'm sure it'll be a success. His mission was to tell us that, yeah, you know, it really isn't that hard. And when you start, yes, it's something you got to work at, build your skill doing, but it's worth it. He once remarked on his ambition to spread joy and where it comes from, to an interview saying, quote, saying, "We've been brainwashed to believe that Michelangelo had to pat you on the head at birth. And, well, we're showing people that anybody can paint a picture that they're proud of." And he says, you know, it might not hang in the Smithsonian, which they made a point in the documentary that he actually does. He is part of an American cultural history exhibit nowadays in the Smithsonian. So he had, in a TV appearance, denied that he would ever, you know, his art would ever be good enough to merit that. But very, I keep using the word apt, but it is perfectly cohesive with the narrative of Congdon and really just the truth about Bob. It wasn't necessarily his painting, it was more so his interaction and engagement, and then what he used the instruction of painting for that made him who he was.
You know, it never stops to amaze me as we travel around teaching this method to watch people who've never painted in only a day or two produce a painting that just, they can't believe it.
And it's appropriate that he would be featured at the Smithsonian, in the Smithsonian, as an icon and a cultural figure, as well as an artist, maybe I should say. So the Joy of Painting in season 29, episode 7, for instance. Any person who has ever wanted to put a dream on canvas, you can do it. And that was his message. You don't have to go to school half your life, you know, drown in debt. You don't have to know Leonardo da Vinci as a personal friend. You can do it.
You see them, their eyes light up, they become so excited, and they can do it, and you can do it. All you need to do is pick up a brush and try.
Just like Bill, Alexander, his mentor, Bob wanted to remove the barrier to entry.
You do it, that's all it is. That's the whole idea about that TV series here. Don't cry, don't cry. You finish it yourself. Because then you know the power of yourself. Okay, see now.
So that those of us without access to mentorship, so many of us don't have that luxury, would be encouraged to take that intimidating first step in through the door. He taught thousands of students and thought that's all it took was to get your foot in the door. And once in, we too could experience the same joy he did when we were watching him on his show create, and all the while encourage us too. And to me, that applies to so many things in life. It's what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to relay what gives me joy. And it's not only the content, but it's being able to communicate and hear back from you guys too. What you guys found interesting about my own interests, how we can relate, or what your own interests that might not necessarily overlap with mine. And that's a beautiful thing, that we can have this evolving dialogue about what interests us, and that I always encourage people to make their own YouTube channel and do this yourself, in the same way Bob wanted people to paint. I think it is an unprecedented availability that we have, this technology right in our hands, in our pockets. Don't need anything to get started. You can work your way up, get equipment. These were donations, and I'm eternally grateful. I really am, for all of you guys. But before I get on too much of the me show, get off my soapbox.
Get off my soapbox. I talk too much sometimes. There. Shoot.
I do have a lot of respect because of that, in what Bill and Bob both, how they've preceded me. They're my predecessors, and how they've influenced me a lot in what I'm doing here. So by this point, you might think I'm painting going a little too heavy on the alizarin crimson there, and painting a too rosy of a picture. I wrote, maybe you think I'm laying on that old alizarin crimson a bit too thick. I did want to acknowledge the obvious, being that I am so influenced by Bill and Bob both. I'm going to have an obvious inherent bias. Look at that. I love that. That's a cool one. And so I might be prone to overlook any negative aspects about Bob. I specifically, because of this, tried to remain objective, and because I knew I ran the risk of leaning too far into his squeaky clean public image that Bob Ross Inc. has so meticulously crafted over the years, for decades now, in fact. But after a few books, 2 documentaries, dozens of episodes, probably 100 at least, that I have watched, which is still not even tip of the iceberg with his 400 episodes that he made. Dozens of articles, couple interviews, comments, forums, Alexander Cruz, and there was one other person that interacted with him and knew him as an acquaintance I was able to talk to and will mention later. I found that we have full license to get as sappy as one of Bob's happy little trees about him and his legacy, Yeah, that was kind of lame, I know, but because he's as stand-up of a guy as we all probably thought he was to begin with. I want to just understand what drove him, what motivated him. We're going to get, like I said, a little bit into the truth that's out there about his company's relationship with him and their legacy a little bit, but primarily this is all about Bob. I did, in all fairness, want to talk about Bob's, sad little, maybe some of the gray clouds hanging over some of him and his legacy. He was married 3 times. I thought for sure when I found this out initially, it'd be a smear on his character. The first wife, Vicky, who actually appears in the documentary, that's Steve's mom, Vicky. I'm sure, like any divorce, especially with a child involved, it's not going to be pretty, but she had nothing but glowing remarks to say, and still does, apparently, as we'll see. So, nothing too negative there. His second wife, he was married 3 times. You would assume he's been divorced twice. His second wife died of cancer in 1992. That was more of a tragedy than anything. Steve admits in the Netflix documentary that, his mom and dad had there were shaky parts of the relationship, referencing his second wife, but he says he recalls Bob and Jane worked it out. It was heartbreaking to hear Bob's gratitude for her and for the condolences given to her in his 1992 one of his episodes that he'd mentioned the previous season. In the following season, he got so many letters, so many call-ins, so much of a warm response to his tragedy. It was really sad to hear that.
In the last series, I happened to mention that I had lost my wife. I have received hundreds and hundreds of cards from people all over the country, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for sharing my grief and for making my wife a very special person in your life, too.
Despite the ups and downs, as all relationships have, Bob cared very much about her, Jane, his second wife. His third wife was a last-minute marriage. It was his nurse, reportedly, Linda Brown. Was certainly surrounded by peculiar circumstances, most of which is honestly better watched in the documentary, in the Daily Beast article by Ramsey. They make that pretty clear. It was regarding his deathbed legal feud that I'll touch upon him, and I'll elaborate upon, actually more than touch upon. We'll get into the details on that. But although I couldn't find much about that relationship per se, and she seems to be all but non-existent as far as internet presence, it doesn't say anything negative about Bob or her for wanting to protect his name and likeness from people he apparently, at the end of his life, tragically, had been partners with and had a falling out with subsequently. Ultimately, I think the biggest smudge I saw in Bob's reputation, and it was a little gray cloud hanging over his relationship with his mentor, Bill Alexander. And Bill seemed like such a sweetheart of a guy, so it was sad to hear this. There's if you look at a lot of Bill and Bob's videos on YouTube, you'll see a lot of people referencing Bill and his influence on Bob. And there was some potential subversion going on with the, Bill's protege partnering with the Kowalskis while he was traveling for Bill's company and starting his own business and eventually shifting into creating his own of oddly similar products as Bill. But the story's not clear-cut. There's some conflicting accounts, as we'll see. But, I think I put in some examples here. It was sad, and they clearly had a falling out and never reconciled, I would say mostly given Bob's unfortunate decline in health pretty rapidly. But I'm going to make a case that, Bob wasn't ultimately deceitful. Fundamentally, he showed character and concern and greatly he revered and paid proper homage to Bill as Bob ascended the ranks of TV cultural stardom. Even if towards the end he wasn't willing to mention Bill, as he quoted to a New York Times article columnist, he's our biggest competitor now. And he was, because Bob's business model, Bob Ross Incorporated, still is to this day, was a direct competitor to Alexander Art. But I don't think you can say anything truly scathing about Bob. It was an unfortunate business conflict, we'll say. Bill possibly even, I found in one comment on a video here, encouraged Bob and his partners to start selling their own lines. He encouraged him, quote, one commenter says, to start his own art supply company because he literally couldn't keep up with the demand. And Bill was getting pretty successful with his own art instruction, and the model Bob and the Kowalskis copied was to have the show which promoted for free, which promoted gave him exposure and promoted his traveling art classes in all across the nation, in which Bob would not only teach one-off students, but would also actually create his own certified Bob Ross instructors. That was Alexander's exact model. And they added profit to their company by making and selling their own paints and paint supplies. So there was a certain amount of tension there because Bob was greatly profiting Bill through Bob's own exposure and promotion of Bill's products. Like we said, the first few years as The Joy of Painting radically and rapidly accelerated in exposure and was getting taken on, I guess, being showed by an exponential number of PBS stations across the country. I guess every local station has their own right to choose what their program is. They just mostly all tend to copy the programming schedules and the same programs that others do. So it was interesting that at a certain point there was, Bob never reached 100% PBS exposure. I guess there was a few holdouts. There was like 5% or something like that. That for one reason or another, I guess they decided either they had a personal vendetta against Bob or someone in his company maybe, or they just didn't have the demand locally, I guess. So there is that. And we could even see here Bill actively promoted.
Turning over Bill Alexander's technique and his legacy to Bob Ross.
I hand over now that almighty brush to an almighty man, and that is Bob Ross. Congratulate you.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you very much, Bill. We look forward to seeing you right here on this channel for the joy of painting each week.
So they clearly, had an a very, what's the word, reciprocal relationship, Bill was sad about that, and, he cried apparently heavily. He said, "He betrayed me. I invented wet on wet. I trained him and he is copying me. It's not what bothers me is that he betrayed me, but that he thinks he can do it better." It was sad to hear that. That's why I'm spending so much time talking about it. But whether as teacher or television personality or friend or father, Bill's bitterness towards Bob's imitation was the only negative remarks I could find about Bob across all these sources. And I'll argue that regardless of the origin of Bob's company, it's not enough to undermine Bob's solid reputation in my eyes. Were Bob and the Kowalskis a little too liberal in their inspiration from, poor Bill Alexander? Probably, most likely they were. But Bill purposely publicized his technique, and this was one part, again, that reinforces my opinion on it. He says in his own documentary that he was well aware of the risk of imitators.
Once in my lifetime, either I teach or I paint and don't show the technique.
I would like to dedicate this show to my beloved friend and teacher, whom we've all watched and loved for many years on public television, Bill Alexander.
So I decided to teach, and I became an almighty teacher, and I could show my technique to everyone that wants to see it, and I made a lot of people very, very happy.
And years ago, Bill taught me this fantastic technique, and I feel as though he gave me a precious gift, and I'd like to share that gift with you.
I think if someone wanted to create a smear campaign, not against Bob Ross Incorporated, it doesn't seem too difficult to do, but about Bob, which would be a much more demanding task, it would be the profit motive even back then with Bob. At the end of the day, I would suggest that we all need money to purchase products and be able to live and raise our, support our family and raise our children. Bob, even to have leisure, you need money. A step beyond just basic necessities. To pursue your interest, to have leisure to take vacations and experience and travel, you need to have disposable income to do something more than, have some sort of sense of self-identity and life experience beyond just what we, quote, do for work. So I'm not in the business of knocking anybody that's not only making a profit, but being able to do something almost, what's the word? I was going to say anthropomorphic, but philanthropic. Almost philanthropic. I mean, it's just a beautiful, larger gift to humanity by making his show free on public television. It's no stretch to say that almost anything can be commodified, which is what I'm getting at, and it's abused quite a bit. And I'll make a point that Bob, that's the one area you could criticize him on, is that he was making a profit, but he's doing it in a much more ethical way than some examples here I thought I'd throw out. Bob was encouraging his customers and clients to create something of their own, not just consume something of his. He was teaching a skill as much as he was developing a product and selling a product. And the beautiful part was his business model integrated self-development at its core. I think there's plenty of worse ideas for business models out there. Business enterprises centered around ecology, ideology, and even spirituality, unfortunately enough, go far more profoundly into the absurd than one could ever say of Bob and his company and his self-aware wholesomeness. Some examples I found was the Che store. Che Guevara, the communist dictator. A literal anti-capitalism online store. Didn't see a shred of awareness and self-irony either, or self-awareness and irony. Apparently even the sacred is for sale. To one New York Times columnist New York Post, who went on an ayahuasca retreat in Costa Rica and had his eyes opened for only $3,500. It's probably closer to maybe $2 million with inflation now. But so you could sell pretty much anything. And Bob, very much on brand, was happy to be capitalizing on his ability to support his family, pursue his dream, and promise joy as an endeavor that he really found consolation in. And he did it on a variety of levels. His company relied on selling paint products in classes, but what most don't realize is, like I hinted at earlier, is that both the show and the several versions of his completed paintings that he did for each show, he did one as a reference, painted it before the program started. In fact, he did all 13 episodes of the season in a few short days. He just recorded them in bursts. So he would paint 13 paintings and then have them there as references out of frame, so he knew how to follow along and where to go. It wasn't as spontaneous as he let on. And he painted one for this book, in fact. So for this one, he did an episode on this one, but this actual painting in the photographs here was a third painting, reference the TV show, and for the book here. For that.
Another thing, a lot of people ask us what we do with all these paintings that we do on TV. Most of them are used to go into the books that we do.
How-to book, Joy of Painting with Bob Ross. And he had one of these for each season, and this book is a best of, greatest hits, kind of. All these paintings and the show were free. Any paintings he ever sold were given to charity, donated, usually to the local PBS stations, different various ones. Largely he advertised this in his show.
But all the rest of them we donate. We donate them to PBS stations all around the country and to charity organizations for them to make a happy buck with.
They were based on interactive participation, viewers calling into the show, wanting to purchase a painting, in which the shows he would keep track of the stations to which viewers called in looking for a painting, and he would donate some of his paintings.
So if you would like to have one of the easiest ways to get it is to call your PBS station and say, hey, get one of Bob's paintings for your next auction. And we'll be glad to donate one to him. And it helps everybody out. You get better programming that way in the PBS station. He puts a happy buck in his pocket.
To where he saw there was a demand, and they would auction it off, the profits of which would just go to supporting the local channel, which is largely government funded.
And you get a painting. So keep that in mind if you want one. Just let your station know.
And even the ones he didn't give away, he generally just gave them to friends and families. And then the certified Ross instructor, the business model was essentially you pay about $400, get certified over a couple weeks to become an instructor who was legitimated and could teach Bob's style, his company's style. And the business model was that you were encouraged because you were taught using Bob's simplified toolkit of paints, only about a dozen paints, made all the paintings. A lot of times, as we'll see with Thomas Kincaid, you have hundreds, at least dozens, multiple dozens of paints. Bob used 1 dozen, oftentimes only, no more than a handful per painting. Simple tools. He used 2-inch brush, which is almost unheard of for someone painting somewhat fine art like he did. It was a very low startup cost for him, and the instructors were heavily encouraged to use their products. So although they reaped profits from the products that they were able to sell during their own teachings, they didn't have to pay any residuals, no royalties after becoming certified, and they themselves could branch out and teach. It could be misconstrued as a pyramid scheme because it's like the head of the pyramid is Bob Ross Incorporated. They make all these little lower rungs that go out and then themselves teach more certified instructors. But they were teaching not only instructors, but teaching others to paint and encouraging them to go home and just paint themselves and continue. They unlike a pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme, their model wasn't based on continuing to paint with the instructors. Their model was encouraging them to continue to buy the Bob Ross paints, but also the self-development that comes and the self-actualization that comes with just getting your foot in the door with Bob's landscapes and floral paintings as a beginner level introduction to painting. And as we'll find out, Bob actually encouraged a ton of professional artists, people to go into art schools that probably never would have, young children to paint. And, these didn't become Bob Ross instructors. They became artists. And their life was probably much more enriched because of it. It's a beautiful thing. So in the end, the point is that this whole business, it really pivoted on Bob's personality more than anything else, I'd suggest. A huge aspect of the likability that he gave away for free on public television was his frankness, his authenticity, his plainness of speech. He didn't dress his technique up in any fancy terms, as we'll put here.
I think maybe we need some trees that are even closer. By putting all these layers in your painting, or planes as they're called, it helps create that illusion of depth and distance in your world. Once again, back to the old fan brush loaded full of color.
And he didn't sell you the rest of the lesson after you paid him a check and, put up a paywall to, get access to the rest of the content. He deliberately dressed it down and gave the whole instruction away up front. He had other instructional videos that were longer than 25 minutes and went into more detail because of that. He had in-person classes that you could pay $400 for, which was a large sum of money back then. But that wasn't necessary to get started. He gave you everything you needed to get started up front with his free show. He made it so that you could actually follow along with the show. Bob was simply making the happy buck, like Bill Alexander often said, prided himself on, to doing good in the world. His business, it definitely profited from the exposure to the show, like I said about the business model, but the experience he was offering on it, the joy he was offering, was pure. He's remembered so fondly today because of this reason. He was authentically glad to be sharing his experience of joy with us. And authentic is the exact word. That's in vogue term these days, marketable, to be an authentic YouTube personality, authentic, Instagram influencer. But that's what Bob was. When it's real, it is marketable because it's an enduring, it's an archetypal ideal of the human personality, is to be authentic, not have too thick of a persona, not be concealing a more genuine self, but being who you are in public. I mean, oftentimes the mark of a stand-up person is the gain of their status in proportion to how similar they act in public and with strangers as they do with people they know and behind closed doors, so to speak. One of the most beautiful, I got a whole bunch of quotes from him, but a really emblematic one of this is that he said, you can have anything you want in the world. There you go, with the encouragement up front. But he follows that with, once you help the people around you get what they want. And that's so true. And I'll elaborate on that in the future. As Steve, his son, said, that was the whole idea behind Bob Ross, that he was going to teach people that they could be valuable, that they could be important in the world. In a world that's so oversaturated with, cheap technology and in a devaluation of labor continually with automation and AI and industrial mechanisms, and just the overpopulation in, putting 35 students in a classroom with one teacher. You can't expect that teacher to be able to give the one-on-one time that's there and needed, and be able to detect and relay to the student their value and their own unique skills and work on that. It has to be a very, unfortunately, generic curriculum, and it takes a rare breed for a teacher to be able to have the energy and have the determination and dedication to be able to give the individual instruction that's required to really let a lot of people know that they got a lot to offer. And that's what Bob was doing. I think he was supplementing this lack in the culture in America and clearly all around the world. The empathy, the individual instruction, and communication of hope, most importantly. Everyone I saw interviewed about Bob, who knew him, said that he was the genuine article. Said he loved seeing people's reaction to learning to paint, Dana Chester being an important one here. In the documentary also, quote, "To me, the first step in accomplishing anything is to believe that you can do it. And I know you can do it." That's a whole nother level of encouragement. It's not just say, hey, you should do this, but to say, I know you can do this.
I get so many letters from people that have tried this and it's working for them, and whole new worlds have been discovered.
It's a beautiful thing. And even if he was able, he was known to have borrowed some of his sayings and rehearsed his sultry style. Even if his live paintings, like I said, weren't as spontaneous as they let on, his belief in the good that's in all our hearts, in his genuine manner that he encouraged and promoted, and
especially my young friends. There's so many young people all over the country who write, and you can't believe what they're painting. You just absolutely can't believe.
Believed in us to be able to be good.
And it creates an interest in art and a caring for nature. And anytime you can instill that in a young person, it's so fantastic, because they're the greatest people in the world.
And help out, create something good, be someone good, is what really mattered. And that's what really showed through. You know, Steve said on the documentary, he said, what we do here now, he said that Bob said to him, what we do here now, people will remember forever. And for a lot of things that's televised and made digital, recorded, it's true. It really is.
And we got to keep this old planet together, boy, because it's all we got at this point. Maybe one day we'll have something else. Right now, though, this is it, so we have to take care of it.
But Bob's legacy is, not Bob Ross the painter, Bob Ross the paint salesman, the instructor, Bob Ross the TV show host. I think it's Bob Ross the friend.
I think everybody needs a friend. Even a tree, even an old tree, deserves a friend.
Thank you, more than anyone, for enjoying and watching our show. We sincerely hope that we teach you something here. Have a super day. God bless. We look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.
Get off my soapbox. I talk too much sometimes.